If I must burn, then let Rome become my funeral pyre.
The horror had already begun by the time the Senate received word that Nero had locked himself inside his villa beyond the crumbling walls of Rome. They had seen emperors fall before, but never like this. Never with such trembling theatricality. Outside the rotting splendor of the Domus Aurea, Nero's infamous golden house, the scent of scorched timber still hung in the air like an unspoken accusation. Rome had burned beneath his gaze. Some said he had sung while it did, plucking his lyre and reciting Homer as flames devoured the heart of the empire. Others insisted that was slander, the bitter venom of senators and historians sharpening their pens for posterity. But myth needs no proof. Only belief. And the belief stuck. Now that same emperor, once wrapped in purple silk in the illusion of divine favor, sat hunched on a cold stone floor, muttering broken verses from Greek tragedies. The curls that once crowned his head like laurel leaves hung in damp strands, clinging to sweat-streaked cheeks. His tunic, once stitched with gold, was torn and stained with the dregs of last night's wine. There were no servants. No music. No guards. Only silence, piercing, punishing silence. Once, he had ruled the world. He had been born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, into the rotted heartwood of the Julio-Claudian line. A family of gods and monsters. Great-grandson of Augustus. Nephew of Caligula. Son of Agrippina the Younger, whose ambition burned brighter than any temple fire. She married her uncle, Emperor Claudius, and positioned her son to inherit the world, not by chance, but by poison. And when Claudius died choking on mushrooms, Nero rose, 17 years old, a boy wearing the mask of a Caesar. Rome, weary and blood-soaked, hoped for gentleness. For a moment, it received it. Nero's first years were touched with mercy. He pardoned enemies. He lowered taxes. He banned executions. He promised peace. And behind him stood Seneca, the philosopher tutor, and Burrus, the praetorian commander, two old men straining to shape an emperor into a philosopher king. But shadows do not sleep. And Nero's were already stirring. He dreamed not of politics, but of poetry. Not of law, but of performance. In the candlelit halls of the palace, he sang arias until dawn, demanding applause. Senators were forced to watch him act in tragedies. He called himself Apollo reborn. But it was not enough to be emperor. He wanted to be loved. And when that love was not given, he demanded it. His mother, Agrippina, who once bent the empire to her will, now challenged his decisions. She mocked his Greek affectations. She sneered at his mistresses. She reminded him that she had made him. So he tried to cast her off, first with exile, then with a ship designed to sink beneath her feet. When she survived, laughing and soaked in salt and triumph, he sent assassins instead. And when they found her, it was said she pointed to her womb and cried, "Strike here, this bore Nero." He did. And yet, in these final days, her ghost walked closest beside him. He saw her in shadows, heard her in the wind. Rome had turned on him. The legions had declared loyalty to another. His name was being chiseled off public monuments. The statues once garlanded in flowers were now defaced with mud and curses. Now, hidden in a borrowed villa outside the city, the last emperor of the Julio-Claudians, descendant of gods, killer of kin, wrapped himself in a threadbare cloak and trembled at every sound beyond the door. He asked the few loyal servants who remained, "What is death like? Is it painful? Could you do it for me?" The man who once believed himself a god now could not lift the blade. Not yet. He walked now not as a man but as myth. Nero, adorned in flowing silks and perfumed oils, roamed the corridors of his golden house barefoot, accompanied by eunuchs and actors, his skin aglow in lamplight, his eyes searching for reverence in every gaze. He had abandoned the old role of Roman princeps, the first among equals. He saw himself instead as something older, something holier, a living god. And like the gods of myth, his desires were no longer tempered by human bounds. He sought not merely to be obeyed but adored. His voice was law. His song was gospel. Rome had to bow not to a ruler, but to a performer. This hunger for affection devoured him. He entered chariot races and declared himself the victor before the dust had settled. He staged elaborate festivals, forcing nobles to sit in theaters for hours while he sang, no one allowed to leave. Women gave birth in the aisles. Men feigned death to escape. He laughed, mistaking fear for awe. Every gesture became a performance. Every cruelty, a work of art. He had his young slave Sporus castrated, dressed him in empress's robes, and married him in a public ceremony, claiming that Sporus resembled his dead wife Poppaea. Poppaea, whose body he had kicked while pregnant, killed by the same foot that once knelt before her. Nero called this love. Rome called it madness. And still, the city played along. Senators clapped. Generals bowed. Artists composed verses in his honor. They all saw what he had become, but none dared speak it aloud. Because to serve Nero was to survive Nero. At least for a while. But the gods he worshipped were cruel. And the city he ruled was not made for immortals. Then came the fire. It began in the merchant stalls near the Circus Maximus, by accident or by order, no one could say. But it spread faster than any blaze before it, leaping from tenement to tenement, turning wooden beams to ash and shrines to cinders. For 9 nights, flames devoured the heart of the city. Nero, away in Antium, returned to find Rome in ruin. And instead of mourning, he built not homes, not temples, but a palace. The Domus Aurea. Gold leaf and ivory columns stretched across a man-made lake, surrounded by gardens and mechanical marvels. At the center, a 100-foot statue of Nero as the sun god. He had raised Rome to make room for his own reflection. When the people grumbled, he found scapegoats. He blamed the Christians, still a fringe sect, despised and powerless. He ordered their torture. They were crucified, burned alive to light his gardens at night. He watched their agony from the comfort of a banquet, praising the ambience as if admiring a well-lit stage. Seneca, his old tutor, tried to steer him back. Quietly. With letters. With silence. But the philosopher's silence began to resemble dissent. And dissent was something Nero could not bear. He ordered Seneca's death, commanding him to open his veins in the Roman fashion. The old man bled slowly in his villa, reciting Stoic verses as if they might dull the pain. Each death made Nero feel more alive. But not more loved. He roamed the city in disguise at night, attacking people in alleys, drunk with the thrill of anonymity. The emperor became his own ghost story. The people feared him. And in his mind, that fear looked very much like devotion. But devotion is not eternal. Not in Rome. The provinces began to boil. Galba, governor of Hispania, declared open rebellion. Armies marched not with Nero's eagle but against it. The Senate, once his stage, began to murmur treason. He had become the monster they whispered about. But now they whispered louder. and still he played the part. In his villa, surrounded by faded glories and silence, he clutched his lyre and asked the gods why they had abandoned him. The gods did not answer. It came not with a blade, but with silence. In the final days, Nero was not deposed by a rival's sword or brought low by a public uprising. He was undone by the sudden absence of voices, the vanishing applause that once shielded him from truth. His inner circle, once overflowing with flatterers and sycophants, had begun to thin. One by one, the loyal peeled away, slipping into the night with excuses and stolen glances. Even the slaves began to vanish, fearing that association with a dying god might poison their futures. The Praetorian Guard, who once swore blood oaths to protect him, now stood idle. Rome no longer saw him as emperor, and neither did they. They had served Caesar. They would not die for an actor. But the final wound did not come from strangers or generals. It came from his oldest companion, the only thing that had always remained faithful, the Senate. Nero had once charmed them with youthful sweetness, softened their suspicions with the language of art. They had laughed at his poems, nodded solemnly at his songs. But now, facing a rising tide of rebellion from Galba, Vindex, and the provinces beyond, they could no longer afford poetry. They declared him a public enemy. The word hostes was spoken in the Curia Julia, the Senate house that echoed with the ghosts of Julius Caesar and Cicero. And in that echo, Nero's fate was sealed. He who had once been divine, was now stripped of name and honor. His statues were smashed. His images were removed from coins. And Rome waited, not with swords, but with silence. Nero fled. Not in imperial fashion, not with triumphal arches or golden chariots, but like a fugitive. Disguised in a tunic and hood, with only a handful of freedmen, he slipped from villa to villa, begging for sanctuary. The same man who had commanded the deaths of senators now pleaded at their doors. No one opened. He ended up at a half-finished villa owned by a freedman named Phaon, near the Via Salaria. There, Nero, Emperor of Rome, voice of the gods, master of 1,000,000 souls, dug a shallow hole in the earth. Not for defense, but to hide in. He lay trembling in the dirt, pressing his ear to the ground, listening for hooves. Every sound was doom. The Senate had ordered his execution in the ancient manner, a phrase as chilling as it was vague. Perhaps scourging. Perhaps strangulation. Perhaps being hurled from the Tarpeian rock, the fate of traitors. Nero, the last of the Julio-Claudian line, would not be remembered as a ruler. He would be displayed as a warning. It was then that a courier arrived. They were coming. The Senate's men. The sound of iron and leather grew louder. Phaon wept. Epaphroditus, one of Nero's few remaining attendants, urged him to act. Nero reached for the dagger. Then hesitated. His hands trembled. He asked, "Is this what loyalty has come to?" Then, almost whispering, "What an artist dies in me." He could not do it. The hand that once signed death warrants across the empire now could not lift a blade to his own throat. So Epaphroditus helped him. Together, they guided the dagger inward. When the soldiers arrived, it was too late. Nero lay gasping in a pool of his own blood, eyes wide in disbelief, teeth chattering, half alive. He died not like Augustus, beloved and wise, nor like Claudius, poisoned in ignorance. He died choking, alone, half-naked, in a borrowed home. The last words of Rome's god-emperor were not prophecy, not defiance, but desperation. Too late. This is far too late. When Nero's final breath rattled from his lips, Rome did not mourn. There were no processions, no state funeral, no coin minted in his memory. The man who once blanketed the city with statues of himself was now denied even a proper tomb. His corpse, pale and swollen, was bundled hastily into a simple coffin by a few loyal slaves. No senators knelt. No generals saluted. And yet, even then, he clung to legend. The freedwoman Act, once his mistress, perhaps the only person who had ever loved him without needing to, bribed officials to retrieve the body. She paid for a modest burial on the Pincian Hill, in the tomb of his nurse. It was an act of mercy, of memory, but not of glory. The emperor who had wanted to be remembered forever was now hidden beneath common earth. Rome exhaled. The city that had sung his praises now tore him from memory. His name became taboo. His portraits destroyed. His art unplayed. History, for a moment, tried to forget Nero. But forgetting is never so clean. The problem with men like Nero is that they leave echoes. Whispers in alleyways. Psalms in the air. A flicker of something almost beautiful, even in the horror. And Rome, even as it cursed him, found itself haunted by him. Rumors spread that he was not truly dead. That the body was a double. That he had escaped eastward to Parthia and would return with an army to reclaim his throne. Some called him Nero Redivivus, Nero reborn. In the years that followed, no fewer than 3 impostors appeared, claiming to be him. One sang in the same trembling voice, another dressed in purple and recited lines from Aeschylus. People believed them. Some even followed. Because Rome, in its marrow, was addicted to its monsters. Even those who hated him could not quite look away. Nero, for all his crimes, had been vivid. A ruler who wept openly, who sang in public, who bled like a man and died like a frightened boy. His very madness made him unforgettable. And the question lingered, was it madness, or was it Rome itself that demanded such madness to survive? Seneca had once tried to teach him virtue, to craft an emperor of reason. But what hope had philosophy against the intoxication of divinity? Nero had not wanted to govern. He had wanted to matter. He had reached for eternity through art, believing that tragedy was a form of immortality. That beauty could cleanse brutality. That applause could replace love. And in that, perhaps, he was more Roman than any emperor before him. Because Rome too dressed its violence in marble, sang songs over its slaughter, painted gods onto its legions, built temples over bones. Nero simply made the mask too thin. He was the mirror held too close. The dream that rotted when made real. And so they buried him twice. Once in dirt, then again in memory. But neither grave was deep enough. History does not end cleanly. It lingers and questions no tomb can silence. And as Rome staggered into the year of the 4 emperors, blood soaking its marble streets anew, some began to wonder, not in public, not aloud, but in private, with the doors shut tight. What if Nero had ruled just a little longer? Would Rome have burned again? Or would it have finally bent to his will? Because beneath the madness, the singing, the murders, the marble, Nero had done what few dared. He reshaped the very soul of the empire. He turned emperorship from duty into theater. He blurred the line between divine ruler and desperate performer. And he showed Rome a reflection of itself it could never quite forget. Had he reigned longer, that reflection might have hardened into truth. The Senate would have dissolved into irrelevance, reduced to stage props and silent masks. The legions, still loyal in parts of the East, might have bent again, if only given time and coin. Art would have become law. Theater would have become state. Rome, the grave and pious republic, would have become a palace of applause. And under that soft velvet mask, cruelty would have crept in like wine-stained shadow. Nero had already rewritten the rules. He elevated slaves, mocked tradition, embraced foreigners, and defied gender norms. Some of it noble, much of it reckless, but all of it irreversible. He had married a man. He had executed senators for writing tragedies he disliked. He had turned private sorrow into public spectacle. If he had lived longer, the empire might not have broken. It might have changed shape entirely. No longer Rome of the Forum and the Legion, but Rome of the stage and the screen. Yet fate did not allow it. Whether by design or despair, the blade found him. And history snapped shut like a poorly written play, unfinished, unsatisfying, and yet unforgettable. But even in death, Nero was not done. His legend slithered forward through centuries, surviving in mosaics, poems, gospels, and nightmares. Early Christians saw him as the Antichrist, Nero redivivus reborn to wreak vengeance. The Orthodox Church cursed his memory, while artists painted him as a pale and weeping boy, eternally caught between crown and catastrophe. Some said he was all cruelty. Others, a misunderstood soul crushed by a machine he could never control. Most settled on both. And so, we are left with this. A boy emperor shaped by poison and performance. A son who killed his mother, then saw her face in every mirror. A singer who demanded his empire become a stage. A man who could murder thousands by decree and still cry when the applause faded. Was he evil? Or simply, too human, in a Rome meant for gods? You decide. Because the horror of Nero is not just what he did, but what Rome let him do. What we, as inheritors of empire and spectacle, continue to allow when madness wears the mask of greatness. And if he had ruled longer, what darker fate might have awaited the empire?